I'm Hannah, 33, a cardiac surgeon who thought nothing could shake me. Until the moment I stood in my sister, Madison's wedding holding a champagne glass, trying to be the supportive sister everyone expected. Then my mother raised her glass and said Madison has been ruining Hannah's life for years. The glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the ballroom floor, the music stopping, every guest frozen watching. In Madison's eyes I saw it. Guilt. That was the moment I realized the sister I thought I knew had been quietly destroying everything I loved. What my mother revealed that day was only the beginning of this family revenge story. Stay with me as I share how I took back my life. I stood there in my navy blue dress, a champagne flute cold in my hand, trying to look like the supportive older sister everyone expected me to be. The chandeliers above us sparkled like they were mocking me the way they caught the light and danced above the guests, whispering that this was Madison's day, not mine. Madison, 30, looked flawless in her designer gown, dark curls pinned back with diamond clips. Her husband, James Hamilton, 34, was beside her, still in that dazed, newlywed glow that made people smile when they glanced at them. My mother, Eleanor, 62, stood at the center of the head table, lifting her glass high, her silver hair pinned perfectly, her smile too wide. To my daughter, Madison, she began, her voice clear over the clinking of forks on plates, who has always been the light of my life. Guests chuckled softly, expecting the usual mother of the bride speech, something about childhood memories and how proud she was. Madison tilted her head, her perfect smile fixed in place, glancing at James with a practiced sweetness. But today, my mother continued, pausing as she looked directly at me. I can't stand here and pretend any longer. A hush fell across the room. I felt the weight of every pair of eyes shift toward me, confusion spreading like a slow wave. My breath caught the stem of the flute slippery in my grip. Madison has been ruining Hannah's life for years, she said, her voice breaking slightly, but she didn't look away from me. I felt the glass slip from my hand, crashing to the floor, the sound sharp and final against the marble tiles. Champagne splashed across my shoes, tiny bubbles clinging to the hem of my dress. No one moved. The music stopped, the laughter froze, and for a moment I could only hear the ringing in my ears. I turned, looking at Madison, her dark eyes, wide mouth opening in shock before twisting into something hard, something I had seen before when we were children, when I had something she wanted. Her hand tightened around James's arm, and he looked at her, confusion and hurt crossing his face. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" Madison hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Eleanor's hand shook as she lowered her glass, her eyes glistening, but she stood firm. "I'm telling the truth, Maddie." James stepped back, looking between Madison and Eleanor, his jaw working as he tried to understand. "What is she talking about?" he asked, his voice cracking. Madison's eyes darted around the room, seeing the guests watching, some whispering, others with hands covering their mouths. Her lips curled into a forced smile. "She's drunk," she said, laughing softly, the sound empty. "She doesn't know what she's saying." Ethan, 36, James's older brother, stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His gaze met mine across the room, steady, searching, trying to piece together what was unfolding in front of us. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't look away. My chest tightened and the room seemed to blur around the edges. I needed to get out. I turned, pushing past a waiter who stumbled back, his tray rattling with untouched desserts. The cold hit me as I pushed through the French doors onto the patio, the winter air sharp against my flushed skin. The snow in the garden was untouched, white and perfect, unlike the chaos inside. I walked quickly across the stones, my heels slipping, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my face, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to hold back the flood of memories that came crashing through. Madison's birthday parties, where I stood at the edge, clapping while she opened gift after gift. Madison's perfect grades, her perfect friends, the way Mom would say. "Why can't you be more like your sister Hannah?" when I stayed home to study instead of going out. The way Madison would smile at me, sweet and sharp, and say, "It's not my fault you're so boring." The way she had shown up at my apartment after Nathan left, hugging me tightly, whispering, "You'll find someone better," while I sobbed into her hair, never knowing she had already claimed him for herself. The cold air burned my lungs as I sank onto a bench near the frozen fountain, snowflakes landing in my hair, melting against the heat of my scalp. I closed my eyes, The sounds of the party behind me muffled by the heavy glass doors, the laughter and gasps, the whispers of secrets long kept finally slipping free. I didn't know how long I sat there staring at the frost, forming on the iron railing, feeling the weight of every year I had spent living in Madison's shadow, carrying the blame, carrying the silence that she had fed on. And now, in front of everyone, that silence had shattered. A soft crunch on the snow made me look up, blinking away the cold tears on my lashes. Ethan was standing there, his breath misting in the air, his hands deep in the pockets of his dark coat. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was going to run again. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, trying to pull myself together. Did she really say it? I asked, my voice hoarse. Or did I imagine it? She said it, Ethan replied, his voice low, steady. Everyone heard her, Hannah. I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders dropping. The cold bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. Why now? I whispered, more to myself than to him. Why would she say that now? Ethan stepped closer, leaving a trail of footprints in the fresh snow, stopping a few feet away. I don't know, he said honestly. But it's clear she's been carrying it for a long time. A burst of laughter from inside the ballroom echoed through the glass doors, sharp and awkward, a reminder that the world inside was still moving while mine had stopped. I shook my head, pressing my palms against my eyes. She just ruined Madison's wedding, I said, almost laughing. She ruined everything. Or maybe, Ethan said, pausing. She finally told the truth. I dropped my hands, looking up at him. His eyes were clear, dark in the soft glow of the patio lights. He didn't look away. Madison's been. I started, but the words caught in my throat. Hannah, he said, his tone careful. What did she mean about Madison ruining your life? I opened my mouth, then closed it, the words fighting to stay hidden like they always did. My stomach turned as memories flashed. Madison borrowing my clothes and returning them stained, telling Mom I lost them. Madison smiling when Nathan left her hand on his arm at a party weeks later. The missed promotion at the hospital, rumors whispered behind my back, Madison hugging me after telling me it's their loss. I looked at Ethan, at the snow gathering on his shoulders, at the kindness in his eyes that I didn't expect to find tonight. She's always been the perfect one, I said, my voice breaking, and I was always the shadow. Every time I thought I could have something for myself, it slipped away, and she was there smiling. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. She took everything I said, my voice firmer now. My mother's love, my chances, Nathan. And I let her. Ethan nodded slowly. Did you let her, or did she take them because she could? I swallowed hard, looking away, the frost on the railing, shimmering like tiny mirrors. Inside, the music started again, a slow song, muffled but insistent, as if they were trying to pretend nothing had happened. I wondered if Madison was inside laughing it off, telling everyone that Mom was confused, drunk, tired. Do you want to go back inside? Ethan asked. I shook my head. I can't, I said, standing slowly. My legs felt weak, but I kept my balance. Where will you go? He asked. I don't know, I admitted, hugging my arms around myself. Anywhere but here. He hesitated, then pulled off his coat, draping it around my shoulders before I could protest. The warmth and scent of him surrounded me, steadying me in a way I didn't expect. Hannah, he said, whatever this is, whatever she's done, it's out now. You don't have to carry it alone. I looked at him, the snow falling around us like a curtain, muffling the sounds from inside, isolating us in this cold, quiet space. I've always been alone, I said softly. You're not now, he replied, his eyes steady on mine. A shout from inside made us both turn. James's voice, angry, demanding, cut through the cold. Madison, what is she talking about? He yelled, the words clear even through the glass. I turned back to Ethan, my heart pounding. It's starting, I whispered. Ethan nodded, stepping back, his breath fogging in the air. Let's see what she does when the lies fall apart. Inside, I could see Madison, her face flushed, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, her mouth moving quickly as she tried to explain, to twist, to control. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold in my lungs, grounding me, reminding me that I was still here. For the first time, I felt the tiniest crack in the fear that had held me for so long. Madison wasn't untouchable anymore. They always said Madison was perfect. It was the phrase I grew up hearing whispered at family dinners, praised at school meetings, spoken loudly by neighbors when she walked by with her perfect curls and perfect smile. "She's such a bright light," they'd say, while my mother nodded, her hand resting proudly on Madison's shoulder. I would stand beside them clutching my backpack, my report card folded inside straight A's, and commendations that nobody noticed. In Newton, where we grew up, the winters were long and the houses were close enough that everyone knew who got into which college, who won which award. I got into MIT. Madison didn't, but that didn't matter. At my graduation party, people asked Madison what her plans were, how exciting her future looked, while I stood in the corner, a cup of soda in my hand, watching her soak in the attention. When I got into medical school, I thought maybe that would be the moment. Maybe then Mom would look at me with that same pride she reserved for Madison. But at dinner that night, when Dad raised a toast to me, Madison chimed in with, "I'm thinking of moving to New York to pursue marketing. I just don't want to limit myself, you know." Mom clapped her hands, eyes bright. "Oh, that would be wonderful for you, Maddie." The conversation shifted just like it always did. Even when I started working at Massachusetts General, when I was scrubbing in on my first cardiac surgery, I could hear her voice in my head laughing, telling me, "Hannah, you're so serious all the time." But serious is what kept people alive on the operating table. I tried to push it away, to ignore the way she shined at every holiday party, the way she drew people in, even the way she'd tilt her head pretending to listen while she planned her next move. A year before her wedding, Nathan and I were talking about moving in together. He had this easy smile, the kind that made me feel safe, made me believe in something steady. He was patient with my long hours, my exhaustion after overnight shifts. Until one day, he wasn't. He came over one evening, eyes down, hands stuffed in his pockets. "I don't know, Hannah. I feel like you're never here." "I'm working," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You know that." "I know," he said, shaking his head. I think we need a break." I remember Madison showing up the next day with coffee and muffins, hugging me so tight I couldn't breathe. "He doesn't deserve you," she whispered, brushing my hair back like we were kids again. "You're too good for him." She took my phone, deleting his number, telling me it was for the best. 2 months later, I saw a photo on social media. Madison on a boat, her hair blowing in the wind, her hand resting lightly on Nathan's shoulder, his arm around her waist. She texted me that night, "It's not what it looks like. We're just friends." I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, the glow of the screen lighting up her words, my chest so tight I couldn't breathe. 3 months before the wedding, I was up for a fellowship at Harvard, the opportunity of a lifetime, something I had worked for since my first day of med school. I stayed late, worked weekends, volunteered for every extra case, made sure my charts were perfect. The week before they announced the recipient, Dr. Patel called me into his office, closing the door softly behind him. "There's been a complaint," he said, his eyes heavy, tired. "A violation of HIPAA, accusations of sharing patient data." What I said, the word sharp, cutting. "We're looking into it," he said. "But for now we have to pause the consideration." I walked out of that office, numb, the hallway spinning around me. Madison was waiting at my apartment, a bottle of wine in her hand, her smile, soft, concerned. "Oh, Hannah," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Maybe this is for the best. You've been working too hard." I pulled away, looking at her, her perfect makeup, her soft curls, the way she tilted her head, that gentle smile. "Who told you?" I asked. She blinked. "Told me what?" "About the fellowship," I said, my voice sharp now. "Oh," she said, laughing lightly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Mom mentioned you were stressed, so I thought I'd come by." She poured wine into a glass, handed it to me, and clinked her glass against mine. "To new beginnings," she said. I sat there holding that glass, the wine untouched, the words turning over in my mind. New beginnings. For her, maybe. For me, it felt like another door closing, another moment slipping away, another part of me being erased, while Madison's smile shined brighter. Madison's smile never slipped, not even when she saw the hurt in my eyes. She moved around my apartment like she owned the space, setting down the wine, pulling blankets over my shoulders, telling me I needed rest. Her voice was soft, but it pressed on my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. "You're too tense, Han," she said, brushing crumbs off the counter. Maybe this fellowship wasn't meant to be. I turned away, hiding the tears, threatening to fall. It was everything I worked for. She paused, tapping her manicured nails against the wine glass. I know, but you work too much. You don't even live. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. I could smell her perfume, sweet and sharp, the same scent she wore in high school when Mom would brush her hair and call her my beautiful Madison. It was always Madison. After she left, I sat in the dark, the wine untouched, the silence screaming around me. I pulled up the photo again, Madison with Nathan, her smile radiant, his arm around her waist as they stood on the pier in Martha's Vineyard. I remembered the day I saw it, my stomach twisting, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I had called her then, my voice small, asking, "Are you seeing him?" She had laughed, that soft, patronizing sound, and said, "Oh, Hannah, don't be silly. Nathan's just a friend." But in the photo, he wasn't looking at her like a friend. I had ended the call, pressing the phone to my forehead, trying not to cry, trying not to scream. Madison had sent a text later that night. "Don't overthink, okay? You need to focus on your career." That was a year ago. 3 months before her wedding, the anonymous complaint had arrived at the hospital and the fellowship was gone. Madison was there hugging me, wiping my tears, telling me it would be okay, but it wasn't. A week after losing the fellowship, I went to Mom's house for Sunday dinner. Madison was there, of course, already seated at the table, telling Mom about the wedding cake, tasting the floral arrangements, the guest list. "James wants to keep it small, but you know me." Madison laughed, twirling her hair around her finger. Mom beamed at her, nodding, hanging on every word. I sat across from them, picking at my salad, my appetite gone. "Hannah, you're so quiet," Mom said, glancing at me. I looked up, forcing a smile. "Long day at the hospital." Madison reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Don't worry, Han, things will get better." I pulled my hand back, the touch burning. Later, as we washed dishes, Madison leaned close, lowering her voice. "You know you could come to the wedding alone or bring someone. I don't want you to feel left out." "I'm fine," I said, scrubbing a plate harder than necessary. She laughed softly. "You always say that." I turned to look at her, really look at the way her eyes glinted, at the slight curve of her lips. "You're happy I lost it, aren't you?" I asked. My voice quiet. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes hardened. "Hannah, don't be dramatic." I dropped the plate into the sink, water splashing onto my shirt. "Did you do it?" I demanded, my hands shaking. She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she had already solved. "Do what?" "Send that complaint," I said, my voice rising. Her smile grew slow and cold. "Why would I do that, Han?" I stared at her, my heart pounding, the room spinning around me. She reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from my forehead. "You should get some rest." I stood there, water dripping from my hands, as she walked out of the kitchen, humming softly, leaving the scent of her perfume hanging in the air. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the words replaying in my mind. Why would I do that? It was the way she said it, the softness of her voice, the certainty in her eyes. And I realized for the first time Madison wasn't careless. She was deliberate, calculated. Madison wasn't just the sister who got everything she wanted. She was the sister who took it piece by piece, while smiling sweetly, while hugging me close, while whispering that she loved me. And I finally saw her for who she was. 2 weeks after the wedding, I was sitting on the edge of a stiff hotel bed, the Boston skyline blinking outside my window, when my phone buzzed. "Need to meet." About Madison. It was from Ethan. I stared at the message, my heart pounding, reading it over and over. I hadn't seen him since that night in the snow, the way he had looked at me when the truth started to crack open between us. I typed back, "Where Harbor Cafe. Noon." I arrived early, the cold Boston wind cutting through my coat as I pushed the door open. The smell of coffee and cinnamon wrapped around me, the soft hum of conversation filling the small space. I found a table near the window, my hands wrapped around the cup of black coffee, trying to steady the shaking. Ethan walked in, his dark coat still dusted with snow, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. He didn't smile, just nodded, and walked over, pulling out the chair across from me. "Thanks for coming," he said, shrugging off his coat. "What's this about?" I asked, my voice calm, hiding the storm inside me. "It's about Madison," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. I stayed silent, waiting. He took a breath, glancing around before looking back at me. Did you know she's been using an email address with my name to request information from the Hamilton Trust? I blinked, the words sinking in. What she's been emailing board members, accountants, even my father's lawyer, he said, shaking his head. Asking questions about the trust, about James's shares, about the family business. Why would she do that? I asked, my voice low. He rubbed his hand across his jaw, frustration flashing in his eyes. I think she's trying to cause tension, make it look like I'm going behind James's back. I sat back, the pieces clicking together in my mind. That's what she does, I said quietly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? I looked down at my coffee, watching the steam curl into the air. She did it to me, I said, my voice steady. She ruined my fellowship at Harvard, she took Nathan, and I think she's been behind other things too. Ethan didn't speak, just watched me, his jaw tight. I looked up, meeting his eyes. She smiles, she pretends to care, and then she takes everything. He leaned back, crossing his arms. You think she sabotaged your fellowship? I know she did, I said, my voice trembling. An anonymous complaint about a HIPAA violation. It was her. It had to be. Ethan looked away, tapping his fingers against the table. James has been distant, he said, his voice softer. She tells him I'm trying to control the family business, that I'm hiding things. And now this. She's tearing you apart, I said, the words tasting bitter. He looked back at me, his eyes searching mine. Why? I let out a breath, shaking my head. Because she can. We sat there in silence, the noise of the cafe fading around us, the truth hanging heavy between us. Finally, Ethan spoke. Do you have proof? I swallowed, forcing down the fear. No, I admitted. But I know her, and I can find it. He nodded slowly, his eyes still on mine. Good, he said. Because if Madison is doing what you say, we need to stop her. I pressed my lips together, nodding, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. I told him about Nathan, about the photo on the pier, about the message that came late at night telling me not to overthink. I told him about the anonymous complaint to the hospital, how it took away the fellowship I had worked for years to earn. I told him about the way Madison smiled when she comforted me, the way she held my hand while taking everything I loved. Ethan listened, leaning forward, elbows on the table, his brow furrowed. When I finished, the silence between us was thick, filled with the clatter of dishes and the low hum of conversations around us. I couldn't read his expression, and the fear crept in again that maybe I had said too much, that maybe he would think I was crazy like everyone else seemed to believe. She's smart, he said finally, his voice low. And careful. Yes, I whispered, my fingers tightening around the coffee cup. He rubbed his jaw, shaking his head. James won't see it. She's already in his head, telling him I'm after his stake in the company, that I'm trying to control the trust. That's what she does. I said, my voice stronger now. She isolates people. Ethan looked at me, his eyes dark and clear. She's been using my name to get information. My father's accountant started asking me why I needed quarterly statements early, why I was questioning the trust structure. I had no idea what they were talking about. A knot formed in my stomach. She's trying to make you look guilty. He nodded, pushing a hand through his hair. And if she's willing to do that to me, her own family, then I believe she'd do the same to you. We sat there, the pieces fitting together, the patterns becoming clear. Madison wasn't impulsive. She was strategic, methodical, patient enough to wait for the right moment to destroy someone's life. I swallowed, the weight of it pressing on my chest. What are we going to do? Ethan looked out the window, the snow falling gently, the streetlights turning the flakes into tiny sparks. He turned back to me, leaning in closer. We find proof, he said. Emails, phone records, anything that connects her to what she's done. She's careful, I warned. She covers her tracks. Ethan's lips curved into a small, cold smile. So am I. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was resolve. For the first time, I wasn't the only one who saw her for who she really was. I have a friend in cybersecurity, Ethan continued. He can help us trace the email she used. If we can connect it to Madison, it's over. My mind raced, thinking of the boxes in my closet, the notes I had kept, the texts she had sent, the voicemails I had saved without knowing why. Maybe, just maybe, they would finally mean something. Ethan looked at me, his expression softening. You've been carrying this alone for too long. I blinked back, the sudden sting in my eyes. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I believe you, he said, his voice steady. A crack of thunder rolled in the distance, the snow turning to icy rain against the window. The world outside blurred, but in that small cafe, everything felt clear. Ethan pulled out his phone, scrolling before turning the screen to me. It was a message sent to a board member requesting documents, under Ethan's name, the language cold and formal. She even signed it with my initials, he said. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. That's her, I said, my voice shaking. That's how she writes. Always polite, always distant. We looked at each other, the unspoken truth hanging between us. Madison had made a mistake. Ethan set the phone down, leaning back, exhaling slowly. If Madison has done what you say, he said, his eyes locking with mine, we're going to take her down. I nodded, feeling the tremor in my hands as I clenched them together. Ethan's words stayed with me as we stepped into the cold, the icy wind whipping across the streetlights, blurring through the fog, rolling in from the harbor. We didn't speak as we walked toward the parking garage, but something had shifted between us, a silent pact sealed in that cafe. The next morning, Ethan texted me. Meet me at the library archives at 9. I arrived early, the scent of old paper and wood polish grounding me as I waited. Ethan walked in with 2 coffees, handing me one without a word as we headed to a corner table. We'll start with her emails, he said, pulling out his laptop. I handed him the box of papers I had kept, old receipts, printed messages, the photo of Madison with Nathan that I had saved like a wound that wouldn't close. For 2 months, we worked in quiet corners of libraries, cafes, and Ethan's small office. We cross-checked dates, messages, financial transfers, matching the pieces like a puzzle we didn't want to see. Ethan's friend in cybersecurity traced the anonymous HIPAA complaint to an IP address linked to Madison's apartment. The words in the complaint mirrored phrases she used, small, cold sentences she thought were unnoticeable. I could hear her voice in every line. Perhaps it would be best if Dr. Miller's behavior was reviewed. Ethan read aloud, looking at me. She really thought she was helping you by destroying you. I swallowed, the words sharp in my throat. That's what she does. We found bank statements where Madison had used my name to borrow $45,000 from our parents, saying it was for my student loans. The money was gone, spent on luxury bags, parties, dinners she posted about with captions like, living my best life. Ethan's jaw tightened as he flipped through the statements. Your parents didn't question it. I shook my head, bitterness in my voice. They thought she was helping me. We found messages to Nathan, texts from an anonymous number claiming I was cheating, sending him screenshots twisted out of context, fragments of conversations I'd had with colleagues about late-night shifts. She made him believe I was unfaithful, I whispered. Ethan slammed the folder shut, his eyes dark. She wanted him for herself. It hurt to say it out loud, but the truth settled heavy and clear. She took him. Ethan opened his laptop again, showing me emails Madison had sent to the Hamilton Trust Board under his name, asking about James's shares, the trust disbursements, the conditions of inheritance. She was trying to pit us against each other, Ethan said, his voice low, dangerous. Did it work? I asked. He met my eyes. For a while. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. Madison had stolen my fellowship, my relationship, my reputation, and had moved on to tear apart Ethan's family, all while wearing that perfect smile. Ethan's hand touched mine, a grounding warmth. She's betrayed all of us, he said. I opened my eyes, meeting his steady gaze. We're going to make this right, I said. Ethan nodded, his fingers tightening around mine for a moment before letting go, his resolve matching my own. We gathered every piece of evidence, organizing it into files, labeling them clearly: HIPAA complaint, financial fraud, relationship sabotage, trust manipulation. Each label was a wound Madison had left behind, each piece a step toward exposing her for who she truly was. And as we worked, I realized the fear that had once held me was gone. It was time to bring Madison into the light. Ethan looked at me across the small table, papers spread between us. We have enough to confront her, he said, his voice low. My pulse thudded in my ears. She will deny everything. He nodded, sliding another document toward me. She always does. I picked up the paper, seeing the loan application with my forged signature, the handwriting too perfect, Madison's neat curves mimicking my own. I remembered the day Mom called thanking me for letting Madison handle my loan paperwork, her voice full of pride for the wrong daughter. She used me. I whispered, the betrayal sharp again. Ethan's eyes softened, but his jaw was tight. She used all of us. We stayed late in the small office Ethan borrowed from a friend, the glow of the lamp pooling on the folders. We labeled everything, building a timeline that stretched back 3 years longer than I wanted to admit. Every vacation Madison took, every designer bag, every party, it was all paid for by money she stole under my name. She told my parents I needed help, I said, bitterness burning in my throat. She told James I was hiding things, Ethan said, shaking his head. For a moment we were quiet, the weight of her lies pressing down the air thick. I studied Ethan's face, seeing the exhaustion, the anger, the hurt she had left behind in him too. She made me believe I was failing, I said, my voice breaking. Ethan's eyes met mine steady. She made me believe I was the problem. A beep broke the silence, an email notification on Ethan's laptop. He opened it, and I leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. It was from his friend in cybersecurity, confirming that the IP address tied to the anonymous HIPAA complaint was traced to Madison's apartment, the timestamp matching the same night she stayed home claiming she was sick while I was covering a late-night surgery. She filed it while you were saving someone's life, Ethan said, his voice cold. I closed my eyes, pressing a hand to my chest. The truth was there, black and white, undeniable. She's going to claim she didn't know, I whispered. Ethan shook his head, closing the laptop. Not this time. He stood, stretching, looking down at me. She's been careful, but she made mistakes. I stood too, feeling the exhaustion in my bones, but also a fire I hadn't felt in years. What do we do now? Ethan glanced out the window, the Boston skyline glittering through the glass. We prepare. He turned back to me, stepping closer. Hannah, she's going to fight back. She's going to try to turn everyone against you. She already has, I said, lifting my chin. He searched my face, then nodded once, resolute. Then we'll be ready. That night, I walked back to my apartment with a box of documents clutched to my chest, the cold biting at my cheeks. Inside, I spread the papers on my kitchen table, each piece of evidence, a shard of truth I had been too afraid to see. Photos of Madison with Nathan, emails to the hospital board, receipts, text screenshots. The lies layered on top of each other, years of betrayal carefully constructed behind a perfect smile. She had taken enough. I pulled out my phone, opening my notes, and began typing everything we would need for the confrontation. The dates, the proof, the witnesses. Every detail, every truth she had buried, I would bring into the light. A knock on my door made me jump, and I opened it to see Ethan standing there, a box in his hands. I thought you might need this, he said, stepping inside. He set the box down, opening it to reveal a stack of files from his family's accounts, proof of Madison's manipulation with the Hamilton Trust. She's not just your problem, he said, his eyes meeting mine, steady and clear. For the first time I saw the path forward, the fear turning into purpose. It was time for Madison to face what she had done. The call came on a Sunday morning while I was reviewing the files with Ethan. Can you come home? My mother's voice was small, almost trembling. We need to talk. Home. That word tasted strange in my mouth now. I'll be there, I said. The drive to Newton felt longer than it was, the bare trees lining the road, snow starting to drift across the highway. I pulled into the driveway, the lights in the kitchen glowing warm against the gray sky. Mom was waiting at the door, arms crossed, her cardigan pulled tight around her. She looked older, the lines on her face deeper, the fear in her eyes sharp. Come in, she said, stepping back. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon tea, a smell that once comforted me. Now it felt like a trick, a blanket hiding something sharp underneath. We sat at the table, the silence between us stretching, the clock ticking on the wall louder than I remembered. Hannah, she started, her hands twisting around each other, there's something I need to tell you. I didn't answer. I waited. She took a breath, her eyes filling with tears. Madison isn't your father's child. The words didn't sink in at first, just floated in the space between us, unreal. What I said, my voice flat. She pressed a hand to her mouth, shaking her head. She's not Phillips. I made a mistake years ago. I felt like the floor dropped out from under me, the room spinning. You cheated on Dad. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. It was one time. I thought it was over, but then I found out I was pregnant. I pushed my chair back, standing up, needing air. And you kept it a secret. I had to, she cried. Philip agreed to raise her as his own. We thought it was the best thing for everyone. I stared at her, my chest tight. Does Dad know Madison knows? She froze, her tears stopping, her eyes wide. She knows, doesn't she? I demanded. Mom nodded slowly. She found out when she was 18. She told me she would leave, that she would tell everyone if I didn't. If you didn't, what? I snapped. If I didn't help her, Mom whispered. I felt like I was going to be sick. I turned away, gripping the counter, the cold marble grounding me. All these years, I said, my voice shaking, you let her do whatever she wanted because you were afraid she would tell. She's my daughter too, Mom said, her voice breaking. I couldn't lose her. I turned back, anger burning through the numbness. You didn't lose her, Mom. You lost me. She reached for me, but I stepped back. Please, Hannah. Don't do anything rash. Don't take this to court. Don't ruin the family. Family, I laughed, a bitter, sharp sound. What family, Mom? She was sobbing now, shaking her head. Please, Hannah, please. She's all I have. I stared at her, memories flooding, and every time she took Madison's side, every time she told me to let it go, every time she ignored the way Madison's lies tore my life apart. All those years, I said, my voice low, I thought you just didn't see it. But you did. You saw everything. She covered her face, crying into her hands. How much did it cost me, Mom? I asked, tears burning in my eyes. How much of my life did I lose because you were afraid Madison would leave? She didn't answer, just rocked back and forth, whispering Madison's name. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling the weight of everything I had lost pressing down on me. Madison had betrayed me. But so had my mother. I turned away from her, grabbing my coat from the chair, needing to leave. Hannah, please, she called after me, her voice cracking. I ignored her, pulling open the front door, the cold wind slapping against my face, snow swirling under the porch light. The world outside felt brutally honest, no warmth to hide in. Don't walk out like this, she begged, clutching the edge of the doorframe. I turned back, my hand on the knob. You chose her, Mom. Every single time. She shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. I was trying to keep the family together. I let out a short, humorless laugh. At what cost? She stepped closer, reaching for me, but I stepped back onto the porch. Hannah, please don't take this to court. Please don't ruin us. I stared at her, the woman who once braided my hair before school, who kissed my forehead after nightmares, now begging me to protect the daughter who destroyed my life. You let her steal from me, I said, my voice low. You let her lie. You let her tear apart everything I worked for because you were scared of losing her. She's my daughter, she whispered, her voice trembling. So am I snapped. She flinched, her shoulders curling inward as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to bear. How long? I demanded. How long have you known she was blackmailing you? She looked down at her hands, twisting them together. Since she was 18. 12 years, I said, the words tasting like acid. You let her control you for 12 years. She looked up, her eyes red. She was going to tell Philip. I couldn't lose him, and you were willing to lose me, I said, shaking my head. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't want to hear it. I turned, stepping off the porch, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. Hannah, she cried out, her voice echoing down the quiet street. I didn't look back. The snow fell harder, soaking into my hair, melting on my cheeks, mixing with the tears I didn't bother to wipe away. I walked down the driveway, past the hedge Madison and I once hid behind as kids, past the mailbox where I used to wait for college acceptance letters, past the home I thought I knew. I reached my car, the windows fogged, the engine cold. I sat inside, gripping the steering wheel, the breath shaking out of me. All those years, I thought Madison was the storm. But my mother opened the door and let her in. I started the car, the headlights cutting through the falling snow, the warmth of the heater fogging the glass as I pulled away from the curb. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove, the snowflakes streaked across the windshield, the world around me blurring into white, and for the first time I let myself feel the full weight of the betrayal. The betrayal of a sister. The betrayal of a mother. And as the road stretched out before me empty and cold, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. It was time for me to stand up for myself, even if it meant standing alone. The invitation arrived 3 days before Christmas in a heavy cream envelope with Victoria Hamilton's precise handwriting. Brookline Estate Christmas Eve dinner 7 p.m. I held the envelope, the weight of it pressing against my chest. A part of me wanted to throw it away, hide, pretend the last few months hadn't happened, but I was done hiding. That morning Ethan called while I was finishing notes on a patient's chart. "Victoria knows Hannah," he said. "She wants to help." I paused, pen in hand, the reality of those words sinking in. She knows about Madison. She's seen the changes in James, the tension, the withdrawals from the company accounts. She's not blind. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. What does she want me to do? Ethan's voice was calm, steady. "Bring everything you have. She's ready to protect this family. She's ready to protect you." That night, I packed the files, the printed emails, the bank statements, the screenshots. Each page was a piece of the truth Madison tried to bury. Snow was falling lightly as I drove toward Brookline Estate, the world outside quiet, the houses glowing with Christmas lights. Inside, I felt the tremor of fear, but also something else. Resolve. Victoria opened the door herself when I arrived, dressed in a navy dress, pearls around her neck, her posture straight despite her age. "Hannah," she greeted, her eyes warm but sharp. "Come in." The warmth of the estate hit me, the scent of pine and spiced cider in the air, the sounds of soft carols playing somewhere in the background. A Christmas I might have loved once. Ethan appeared at my side, taking my coat, his eyes meeting mine with reassurance. "You're not alone." Madison was there, of course, wearing a red dress, her hair perfect, laughing with James as if nothing in her life was fragile. She glanced over, her eyes meeting mine for a brief second, a flicker of something crossing her face before the smile returned. She didn't know yet. James came over, his hand on Madison's back, his eyes tired. "Hannah, glad you could make it," he said, offering a small smile. I nodded, unable to find words, as Madison leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek, looking at me with a sweetness that felt like acid. "Hope you're ready for a beautiful evening," she said. I swallowed, tightening my hand around the folder in my purse. "I am." Dinner was served in the grand dining room, the table set with crystal and china, the candles flickering, casting shadows on the walls. Madison was the center of attention, telling stories, charming the room, her laughter ringing out as if she owned every person there. I watched her every gesture, every glance toward James, every time she leaned in to whisper something, planting seeds of control the way she always had. Ethan sat across from me, nodding once when Madison turned away, letting me know we were still together in this. Victoria raised her glass halfway through dinner. "Before dessert, I'd like to gather in the sitting room," she announced, her voice calm but firm. Madison's eyes flickered, a hint of annoyance crossing her face before she smiled again. "Of course, Victoria." I excused myself to the powder room before we moved, gripping the sink, looking at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked pale, the shadows under my eyes darker, but my eyes were clear. It was almost time. I stepped out of the powder room, the folder pressed against my ribs, steadying my breath. Victoria stood near the fireplace, speaking softly with Christopher, James, and Ethan's father, her expression unreadable. She saw me and nodded once, a silent signal. "Everyone, let's move to the sitting room," she called, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. James guided Madison by the elbow, her laughter too loud as she leaned into him, still performing. Ethan walked beside me, his hand brushing my arm, grounding me. The sitting room was warm, the tree in the corner glowing with white lights, the scent of pine sharp in the air. Everyone found seats, the family gathering like any other Christmas, except tonight everything was different. Madison perched on the arm of James's chair, her red dress pooling around her eyes, scanning the room, calculating. Victoria stood holding her glass of water, clearing her throat. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady. "Before we continue this evening, there are matters that require our attention." Madison's smile tightened. "Victoria, is this really necessary on Christmas Eve?" Victoria ignored her, turning to me. "Hannah, dear." My hands shook slightly as I stepped forward, pulling the folder from my bag, the sound of paper brushing against itself louder than the soft carols playing in the background. "I know this isn't what anyone expected tonight. I began, my voice surprisingly clear, but there are truths that need to be spoken. James shifted in his chair, glancing at Madison, confusion on his face. Madison's smile faded. Hannah, what is this? Ethan stepped beside me, opening his own folder, laying out documents on the coffee table. It's time you told the truth, Madison. Madison's eyes flicked between us, her lips parting but no words coming out. I took a breath, pulling out the first printed email, the header clear for everyone to see. This is the email sent to Harvard, falsely accusing me of violating HIPAA. It came from an address traced back to your devices, Madison. Gasps filled the room, the air tightening as James sat straighter, looking at his wife. That's ridiculous. Madison snapped, reaching for James's hand, but he pulled it away slightly. I laid out the next document. This is the bank record showing withdrawals from your parents' account using my name as justification, Madison. Madison's face paled, her mouth opening then closing. And these, Ethan said, placing printed screenshots on the table, are communications showing your attempts to access the Hamilton Trust using my name, trying to pit James and me against each other. Victoria remained standing, watching Madison with eyes that had seen decades of family triumphs and betrayals. You've put this family at risk, Madison. Stop it, Madison screamed, standing, her face red, her hands trembling. You can't do this to me. James stood 2 stepping away from her. Madison, is it true? Her eyes darted around the room, looking for someone to save her. James, they're lying. They're jealous. They have evidence, James said, his voice breaking, and I need to know the truth. Madison's breathing quickened, her hands clenching, unclenching. You don't understand what she's done to me all these years, she hissed, pointing at me. I met her gaze, my voice calm. The only thing I did was trust you. Her face crumpled, rage and fear twisting together, and for the first time, Madison had no words left to spin. In that moment, I knew. Tonight, Madison would lose everything, and I would get my life back. The living room felt too bright, the Christmas lights blinking softly, as if mocking the tension that held every breath hostage. Victoria stood near the fireplace, her posture commanding the room. Everyone, please sit down, she said, her voice calm but leaving no room for argument. James lowered himself onto the arm of the sofa, his eyes on the floor, while Ethan hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. Madison's heels clicked on the polished floor as she paced. What is this? Some intervention. Because if it is, I'm leaving. No, Madison, Victoria replied, folding her hands. Tonight is about the truth. Madison scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. The truth. According to who? Her, she pointed at me, her eyes sharp. I sat on the edge of the chair, my fingers brushing against the folder in my lap. The weight of it felt heavy, but it was the weight of freedom, not fear. Play it, Victoria said. Ethan moved to the television, connecting the laptop we had prepared. The screen flickered and the first document appeared, an email chain. Madison's fake address, the false HIPAA complaint sent to Harvard. What is this? Madison demanded, stepping forward, her voice rising. You know exactly what this is, Ethan said quietly. Stop this, Madison snapped, turning to James. James, please. James lifted his gaze, pain and disbelief clouding his eyes. Tell me it's not true, Madison. She opened her mouth, but the next slide appeared, screenshots of the anonymous messages to Nathan hinting at an affair I never had. My stomach twisted as I relived those nights, the endless tears, the silence from Nathan, and the final cold goodbye. Madison, please, James said again, his voice cracking. Tell me you didn't do this. Madison laughed, but it was hollow. You're really going to believe this over me? Over your wife? Ethan's voice was steady. Over a liar, yes. Madison's face flushed, her jaw tightening as she glared at Ethan. You think you're so righteous, don't you? Always the perfect son, the perfect heir. This isn't about me, Ethan shot back. This is about you destroying people's lives. Madison's eyes flicked to me, cold and sharp. You think you're better than me, Hannah. You're nothing. You've always been nothing. I stood slowly, meeting her gaze, my voice calm. And yet you spent your life trying to ruin mine. The next slide appeared, bank statements showing the withdrawals from my parents' savings marked as help for Hannah but spent on designer bags, dinners, and Madison's weekend getaways. Eleanor let out a strangled sob from the corner, her hands trembling as she covered her mouth. Madison, please tell me this isn't true. Madison turned to her, her voice shaking. Mom, you know I needed those things. You know why? You lied to us. Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Madison's face twisted, rage and fear battling in her eyes. You owe me, she screamed. James stood then, his movement slow, deliberate. He reached for his ring, sliding it off his finger, the metal catching the twinkle of the Christmas lights before he placed it on the table. Madison, we're done, he said, his voice low but unyielding. No, Madison screamed, lunging toward him, but Ethan stepped between them, holding her back with one arm. You're not going to hurt him anymore, Ethan said, his voice like steel. Madison's breathing turned ragged as she pulled away, stumbling, her eyes darting around the room looking for an ally. She found none. Victoria's voice cut through the room like a blade. Madison Hamilton, you are hereby removed from the Hamilton Trust, effective immediately. The $45,000 will be returned to Hannah. And you will leave this family's business and this city. Madison stared at her, her face pale, her lips trembling. You can't do this, she whispered. I can, Victoria replied, her gaze unwavering, and I will. Silence settled over the room, thick and final, as Madison's eyes turned to me, filled with a hatred so cold it almost made me shiver. Almost, because for the first time I felt nothing but relief. She lunged toward me, her hands shaking, her eyes wild like a cornered animal. Chị đã phá hủy cuộc đời em. She screamed, her voice cracking, echoing through the room. Ethan stepped between us, steady, firm. No, Madison. You destroyed your own life. Madison's breath came in harsh gasps, her eyes darting around, searching for someone to save her. Her gaze landed on Eleanor, who was sobbing quietly, shoulders shaking, hands clutching a tissue that was already soaked through. Mom, Madison shouted. Tell them to stop. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red hollow. I can't, Madison, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Madison took a step back, her mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. Victoria's voice was calm, unwavering. It's over, Madison. No, Madison screamed again, throwing a glass across the room, shattering it against the wall. Shards fell to the floor like ice. James flinched but didn't move toward her, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes filled with disappointment and sadness. Madison turned to him, tears streaking her makeup. James, please, I love you. James shook his head slowly. I don't even know who you are. She sobbed, dropping to her knees, clutching at his pants leg, but he stepped back, leaving her grabbing at empty air. Ethan crossed his arms, watching his jaw tight. You will leave Boston tonight. If you don't, the authorities will be involved. Madison's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing into slits. You wouldn't dare. Victoria stepped forward, her cane tapping softly against the floor. I would, Madison. You have stolen enough from this family. The room fell into silence again, the only sound the soft hum of the Christmas lights and Madison's ragged breathing. She slowly stood, brushing her hair back, her hands trembling. Her eyes found mine, sharp and burning with hatred. You think you've won, Hannah. This isn't over. I met her gaze, steady, unblinking. For me, it is. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. You'll regret this. All of you will. She turned, storming out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor, the front door slamming so hard the windows rattled. Silence settled once more. Eleanor collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. James sat down, staring at the empty space where Madison had stood, breathing heavily as if the weight of years had finally settled on his shoulders. Victoria turned to me, her eyes softening for a brief moment. You did the right thing. I nodded, but inside I felt hollow, empty, like the wind had been knocked out of me. All I could think about was everything Madison had taken from me, from us, and how the truth, even when it sets you free, still leaves scars. Ethan moved closer, resting a hand on my shoulder, grounding me in that moment, reminding me I was not alone anymore. I looked around the room, seeing the shattered pieces of glass, the broken family, the silence that replaced Madison's chaos. I realized the fight was over, but the healing was just beginning. As the snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in a blanket of white, I felt the cold seep in, reminding me of the winter we had survived. But deep down, I knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. A life rebuilt from truth, no longer living in Madison's shadow, no longer hiding behind fear. I turned to Ethan, meeting his steady gaze, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. We walked out of Victoria's house into the cold night, the snow falling softly around us. Ethan's hand found mine, warm, solid, grounding me in the present, reminding me I wasn't alone anymore. "Are you okay?" he asked, his breath visible in the winter air. I nodded, taking in a deep breath that seemed to clear away the heaviness in my chest. "For the first time in a long time, I think I am." We stood there for a moment, letting the silence of the night settle over us, the lights of Boston twinkling in the distance. 3 months later, I stood in the hallway of Harvard Medical, the letter in my hand trembling slightly. "Congratulations, Dr. Miller," Dr. Patel said, smiling at me. "We're glad to have you join our team." I managed a smile, my heart pounding with a mix of relief and pride. I was finally back where I belonged, earning my fellowship, stepping into the operating room with the confidence I had almost lost. Ethan met me outside, his grin wide, his eyes proud. "Told you they'd see your worth." I laughed, the sound feeling foreign but good, like something that had been locked away for too long. I almost didn't believe it would happen. He pulled me into a hug, holding me for a moment longer than necessary, and I let myself sink into the warmth. Later that week, I signed the lease on a small house near Martha's Vineyard, the sea breeze filling the rooms, the soft crash of waves replacing the constant noise of fear that had lived in my mind. I painted the kitchen yellow, let sunlight flood the rooms, bought flowers for the table just because it made me smile. I found myself cooking dinners, inviting Ethan over, sharing quiet evenings filled with laughter, movies, and conversations about everything and nothing. We would walk along the beach, our shoes in our hands, the cold sand beneath our feet, the wind tangling my hair as I leaned into him. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in pink and orange, Ethan looked at me, his eyes soft. "You deserve this, Hannah. You deserve peace." Tears filled my eyes, but they were warm, not bitter, not broken. I'm finally starting to believe that. Meanwhile, Madison's world was crumbling. She lost her rights to the Hamilton Trust, legal notices flooding her inbox, her friends pulling away as the truth came out. She left Boston quietly, her social media disappearing, her name whispered with pity rather than envy. Eleanor called, left voicemails, sent letters, each one asking for forgiveness, asking to see me. I answered, once my voice steady. "I forgive you, Mom. But I can't forget." I hung up before she could respond, letting the silence settle, not as a wound this time, but as closure. One snowy afternoon, Ethan and I walked down Commonwealth Avenue, the Christmas lights still hanging, the city quiet under the fresh snow. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, our steps falling in sync, the cold air sharp but refreshing. I looked up at the sky, the snowflakes landing on my face, melting against the warmth of my skin. For the first time, I felt free. Free from Madison's lies, free from the fear, free from the weight of a family that had never seen me. Free to live, to heal, to love. Free to begin again. Ethan parked the car outside my small cottage, the headlights cutting through the falling snow. "Need help with the boxes?" he asked, already stepping out into the cold. I shook my head, smiling as I carried the last box inside, the soft thump of the door closing behind us. The house smelled like fresh paint, and the rosemary bread I had baked earlier warm and comforting. Ethan followed me into the kitchen, his hands in his pockets, looking around at the small, bright space I now called home. "This is you," he said quietly. "Bright. Calm. Finally yours." I looked around, seeing the yellow curtains, the small table with 2 chairs, the shelves lined with cookbooks and tea tins. "It is," I whispered, feeling the truth of it settle in my bones. We spent that evening unpacking, Ethan helping me place books on the shelves, laughing when I insisted on arranging them by color. We paused to eat soup, sitting across from each other, the steam curling between us, warming our hands. At one point, Ethan reached out, brushing a stray hair from my face, his touch gentle, unhurried. "Hannah," he said, his voice low, "you're allowed to be happy." I swallowed the words sticking in my chest before I let them out. "I know." After dinner, we walked outside, the snow crunching under our boots as we made our way toward the beach. The air was sharp, the wind carrying the scent of the ocean, the waves crashing softly in the distance. We stood there, the world quiet around us, the stars peeking through the clouds, the moonlight reflecting on the water. Ethan took my hand, holding it firmly, grounding me. "You're safe now," he said. I looked at him, really looked, seeing the man who had stood beside me when everything fell apart, who had chosen to believe me. "Thank you," I said, simply letting the words carry all the weight they needed to. He squeezed my hand, his smile soft but certain. "Always." A week later, I received a letter from Harvard, the official confirmation of my reinstatement and my new position as the youngest cardiac surgeon in the department. I stood there, the letter in my shaking hands, tears falling before I could stop them. I thought of every night I had doubted myself, every whisper of Madison's lies, every moment I had almost given up. And then I thought of now, of this moment of the future that was finally mine. That evening I called Eleanor, answering her repeated calls for the first time. "Mom," I said, my voice calm. "Hannah, she started, her voice breaking. "I forgive you." I interrupted, letting the words settle. "But I won't forget." I ended the call, setting the phone down, breathing out the past I had carried for so long. Days turned into weeks, and the snow began to melt, revealing the promise of spring. Ethan and I spent mornings drinking coffee by the window, evenings walking along the shore, letting the wind and salt clear away the last pieces of fear. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, the shadows of the past trying to pull me back. But I would turn, see Ethan there, steady, present, and I would remind myself I was free. Madison was gone, facing the consequences of her choices, her name now associated with scandal, not perfection. And me, I was living. I was healing. And for the first time, I was happy. Have you ever been in a situation like this? Share in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.